Viticulture and Enology Coordinator at Wilson Street Farm. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thanks very much. Thank you. Can everyone hear me, or should I mic up? You're fine? Okay.
Yes.
And then the clicker, or is it just on this?
Oh,
Yes, a clicker?
it's the, so you're doing it through here? Well, I do it so I'm Christie.
Just for, okay, perfect.
Yeah, down in left and right.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about what I was hoping we could cover, but I'm most interested in what you want to know. So I want to make sure that we have enough time at the end of this for questions and some conversation. I want to talk about comparing sustainable organic and biodynamic agriculture, which are kind of the standards, and a relatively new concept called regenerative agriculture. And you'll see sort of why this is an important terminology and how it differs from what you've traditionally seen as some of the more biologically based disciplines. Sort of an overall biological perspective on agriculture. Another issue is carbon and regenerative agriculture. Carbon sequestration is obviously a big deal. And if you look at the potentials we have two routes we can go with global warming. One is we have to stop pumping so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's just a given. But the problem is we've already crossed several critical thresholds. We have to start sequestering carbon. So how do we do that? And I think that the most poignant way of doing that is through agriculture, and we'll touch on that. Regenerative agriculture, what it is, and how you can get going in it. And I want to talk about the microbiome in the vineyard, because it ties into a concept in winemaking called terroir. How many people here are over 21 and can legally drink? How many people are under 21 but still drink a fair amount of wine? Okay, it's honest. It's good. As long as you're not on the roads, it's cool. And you got your parents' permission, right? Terroir is a big deal in wine. It has a lot to do with ecosystem sciences and things, so it's an interesting concept. So first, a little bit about my background, not to brag, but if you have an idea of where I've come from and how I've gotten here, and you have certain questions, maybe you can frame it. This is a picture of the Trout Lake Valley. That's Mount Adams in the background, and that is a 40-acre field of Echinacea purpurea. So if you've ever had a cold and you take an Echinacea, it probably came from this field. It was the largest field. We're actually the largest organic herb farm in the world. 2,400 acres, diversified medicinal botanicals. We have very few culinary botanicals, mostly medicinal.
Here, Steve, you can be just the one.
Sure. Oh,
Keep talking.
I went from there to Liner Health Products, which later became a division of Pfizer Pharmaceutical. It was an interesting time when the pharmaceutical industry was running out of good leads for new drugs, and they looked at traditional medicine and actually got a lot of them. We were hoping we could use the platform of the pharmaceutical to create a better alternative medical system, or I should say a complementary medical system in this country. That worked so-so. The science worked beautifully. The politics and the money was a train wreck, which is an interesting sort of lesson that oftentimes law and politics have more to do with where science goes than where good science goes. And so as good scientists, it's good to know your science, but it's also good to know what the political atmosphere is that you're working in, because we have to live in that. I worked with the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. That is the drug standard setting agency. It's not actually a U.S., it's a private organization that is in the United States, and 46 different countries use it for their primary pharmacopoeia. The pharmacopoeia is the cookbook of all drugs, basically, if you don't know. And that was developing a herbal medicine compendium and a traditional medicine compendium. Researchers include National Institutes of Health and the Global Institute for Tibetan Medicine, which is what brought me to Temecula, because the Dalai Lama's physician lives in Temecula, believe it or not. So in Tibet, they have a physician for the country, and then there's a physician for every major continent. And the American continent is in California, and it just so happens that he lives in Temecula. And so I wound up doing work with the Dalai Lama's physician and started going to wineries and realized that on the cutting edge of organic viticulture, it's really happening in vineyards. So let's take a quick look at sustainable. Sustainable wine growing is basically a system that just says that if you have a business, you have to look at the environmental, the social, and the economic factors of those business. And you have to make improvements in all three of those on a continuing basis. That's the fundamental concept of sustainable. Sustainable means that the outputs that you're putting and the inputs you're putting back into the system should at least be equal. That's not what actually happens, unfortunately, but it's a moniker that's used for promotion, and at least the businesses are thinking about it and moving in a direction that shows some improvement. The big one in California is the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance. Our friends in New Zealand actually have a much better system. And in wine growing, there's one up in Paso Robles area called SIP certified. And the reason why it's a better system is you have to be a professional agronomist to be part of the association. So it's not a lot of marketing people kind of going on. It's agronomists actually going, how do we get to sustainable? Organic, of course, is the one you've all heard about. Organic started out a lot more like sustainable. Back in the early 80s, when I first got into the organic movement, it was led by a group called Oregon Tilth. And as their name would suspect, they were very interested in the tilth, the health of the soil, is to be constantly improving the carrying capacity and the biological diversity of the soil. They weren't so concerned about what you didn't use, but they said to do that, you had to limit the amount of chemical inputs that you put in. Once that became Washington State program, and then the federal government got involved, quite frankly, it got really watered down. Right now, all organic says is there's a list of things that you can't use, like synthetic fertilizer, pesticides, antibiotics, food additives, genetically modified organisms, etc. It doesn't tell you what you should be doing. It tells you what you can't do, which is a decent start. I mean, when you buy stuff that's organic, and if you have concerns about genetically modified food, at least it tells you that much. If you're concerned about some of the synthetic, glyphosate, for example, commonly known as Roundup, and if you're concerned about that, it's not going to be used on an organic farm. So it's a big step in the right direction, but I don't think it actually asks all the correct questions. The granddaddy of all of this is biodynamic. And it was started by a really interesting character called Rudolf Steiner. If you are in agriculture and you like wacky people, read Steiner. Steiner is out there in a really interesting way. So Steiner is the one, have you heard about like the preparations where they make these preparations for application? You have to turn it so many times, opposite the rotation of the planet, it has to be on a full moon and kind of all this stuff. So as a scientist, that should strike you as somewhat suspect. On the other hand, if you actually listen to what Steiner was talking about, the basic concepts of biodynamic is that the farm is a self-contained individual entity that maintains the improving health of the soil, which is the primary way in which the farm evolves. I couldn't agree with that more. Healthy soils protect local environments, produce high-quality crops, which in turn means better feed for livestock and better food for human beings. I couldn't agree more with all of those. Those are really good ideas. Here's my take on Steiner. I think Steiner had some sort of intuition about how the world really works. A little bit like Mendelov when he, imagined the periodic table before we really had a structure for the periodic table. Rumor has it, or legend has it, he had a dream about the periodic table and started filling it out that way, and he goes, oh my gosh, this works. I think Steiner was sort of similar. I think Steiner had an insight into quantum mechanics and quantum chemistry, that he understood that the world isn't just physical, that the old Bohr model of the proton and the neutron in the middle and the electron flying around is a great map, but that's not really what happens. It's a little more energetic in nature, and it's not quite that specific, which is why Steiner talked about energetics so much. So I think what happened with Steiner is he was a person who was conceptually maybe 100 years ahead of his time. He just didn't have the vocabulary or the scientific tools to describe what was going on. As young students, if you guys are interested in agriculture, you now have the tools. We're getting interesting tools that are revealing a lot of these things to us, and it's an incredibly exciting time to be in agriculture right now. It's, the old thing of, being a farmer with a pickup. Well, actually, I do have a 20-year-old beat-up pickup truck, I have to admit. But I also know how to use lab equipment. I read a lot of scientific literature. it really is that kind of Renaissance living now. Is in agriculture, you not only get to drive tractors and cool pickup trucks, and I gotta tell you, driving a tractor, it appeals to the little kid in all of us, it never gets old. It's cool every time you run a tractor, it's just cool and fun. But that's kind of my take on Steiner and where all that's going. And the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is sort of the topic of this, and it's something called regenerative agriculture. It is a term that doesn't particularly have a good specific definition, but there are some real leaders of it. I think one of the leaders is a group called John Kempf at Advancing Eco-Agriculture. And I think they're doing some of the best work sort of pulling modern knowledge together and modern tools together, but with a great biological understanding. So we're going to dive into that pretty heavily. A quick overview of the basic theory between chemical and biological. And by the way, even though I obviously fall way on the side of biological, this isn't a bashing of the chemical system. Post-World War I and post-World War II, coming out of that, the Industrial Revolution, this made a ton of sense for the science at the time. So I don't, belittle the people who came before us. Now, unfortunately, this actually happened before this. The basic theory of chemical agriculture happened with a gentleman by the name of Vincent von Liebig, which is kind of an unfortunate name if you're trying to make a point that your theory is right. But anyway, Vincent von Liebig basically said that chemicals have to be soluble and that's the only way plants can absorb them. Later on, he retracted that and said, I didn't quite get it right, there's something else going on. But the chemical industry already grabbed hold of it. And so they started promoting it a lot. This is another example of that whole thing of politics versus and economics versus good scientists. As good scientists, it's our job to always stand up and go, no, that's not what the science shows. But it's also important to say, if there's one thing you learn in science, it's how little we know about how the world really works. So question everything, doubt everything, including your own work. You look at your own work, okay, this looks like what it's doing, but what if it's not? Because that's the challenge. Unless you can prove something's wrong, you can't prove it's right. So the biological approach is all plants evolved in a highly complex mineral and organic biological matrix. Not quite like the moon, sort of. It's not soluble, but available. And this is a really important concept. When you do biological soil tests, there's actually 3 tests that you do. You do one that just shows the pure mineral composition, 2 that shows the loosely held chemicals on the colloid, and 3 the ones that are actually water soluble. And then you should actually do a 4th one, which is a biological test. So this is where these theories actually aren't that far off, is you can't just have elements in the soil and have plants get at them. They need to be released usually by biological action, which usually involves light acids or bases that chemically break them off and physically break them off. But it's soluble, but not soluble, but available. As opposed to the chemical one, which says mostly NPK, fertility assumes that the parts are greater than the whole. Large-scale commercial interests are supporting this, and basically what it says, if it's not soluble in water, then the plant can't absorb it. Which the challenge of that is that sort of works on the bench, right? But the bench doesn't have a complex microbiome that's releasing these. So it's another one of those things where you got to be careful where when you're doing stuff on a bench, you're basically making a map of what's going on versus what really happens in nature. So it's an understandable confusion. And it works, chemical agriculture works. If you put urea or ammonium into the soil, it will be absorbed by the plant. Part of the reason it works so good is especially with things like ammonia, when you put it in the soil, it kills most of the microbiology in the soil. And all those nutrients that are tied up in the microbiology suddenly are water soluble, available to the plants, they're dead. So what winds up happening is the first year or 2 you use it, you get great results. Then the 4th and 5th year had to add a little more, the 5th and 6th a little more. To give you some ideas, the original applications of nitrogen fertilizer for corn in the Midwest in the 50s and 60s were somewhere around 20 units per acre. It's now up to 180 units per acre, which means they're getting 0 or close to it from the actual soil. Unfortunately, in places like Napa, where there's multiple croppings going on and the watershed being contaminated by nitrogen in the water, they're not adding any because they pick up enough units of nitrogen from the irrigation water to supply the supplemental needs that the plants need. Think about that for a second. The water in the aquifer has enough excess nitrogen in it that you don't need to add surplus. And when you read some of the trade journals, they all go, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. It's coming with free fertilizer. And I'm like, duh, your kids are drinking this water. How is that okay? There's got to be a lot of other issues that come along with this. So this is another way of, as a good agronomist, this is how you should see plants. Everyone else sees the stuff above the ground. But if you actually look at a plant, the majority of its biomass is actually underground. And that's the way you want to be thinking about it, is that where most of the nutrients in this plant are coming from are underground. And here's why that relationship is so important. Plants have this incredible ability to turn carbon dioxide into sugar and oxygen. Carbon dioxide and oxygen into sugar. That is an amazing trick. We can do it in the lab, but it takes an unbelievable amount of energy at high temperature. Plants do it routinely at room temperature, and they do it really, really well. As a matter of fact, they do it so well that some plants only utilize about 35 to 50% of the sugars for their actual biochemical reactions in the plant and for setting fruit, which means that you have anywhere from 40 to 60% surplus sugar that the plant's producing. And you ask why would it produce all this extra sugar? Because if you study nature, the one thing you've got to know is it's efficient. Nature doesn't do excess. And the reason it does it is sugar is like the engine for most life. You know, I had a professor in college who was Indian, and he kept, this is pre-Google days, right? And you're in a lecture hall like this, if somebody said something weird, you couldn't look it up. You had to like go to the library and look it up. And he had this term called Vigananda. And I couldn't find it anywhere. And so one day I, raise my hand and I go, excuse me, professor, but none of us can figure out what the glucananda is. And he goes, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm missing Sanskrit and English. Glucose is glucose. You know what glucose? Ananda means the bliss of in Sanskrit. And he said, all life loves glucananda. It's the bliss of sugar. And he said, show up with any little kid and give him a candy bar, and you will see bliss on his face. He goes, that is the way sort of all nature is. It's love, it runs on sugar. So what the plant's doing is producing extra sugar and pumping it into the soil to feed the microbiology. Specifically, it really feeds bacteria. Bacteria bind up the soils in a one-to-one relationship where they really don't release it. But then fungi comes and eats that, cilia's coming and eat that. As it goes up to higher life forms, the nutrients basically get cleaned out and gets absorbed by the plants. But the cool part about this is the plant starts this storage bank of nutrients with bacteria, and as it needs it, it releases things. And it can release things, but for example, fungi are really amazing. There's some really interesting research now going out with fungi that talks about how they act as a neural network. But the other thing about fungi is they have enough communication with the plant that if the plant needs something that's really hard to get, like molybdenum, really hard to get out of the soil, fungi have such a great network they can find it. The plant will say, I know you need sugar because you're a non-photosynthesizing organism, so I know that you are desperate for sugar. I'll tell you what, I will trade you this whole table full of cookies and candies for one molybdenum. The fungi's going, what a chump. He just gave me a whole plate full of cookies and candies, and all I have to give him is one molybdenum. The plant's thinking, sugar is so easy to produce, it's ridiculous. And they just gave me this gem of molybdenum. That's that soil-led relationship that plants have. That's why plants pump so much extra sugar into the ecosystem. In viticulture specifically, one of the reasons why I'm interested in studying viticulture is, I'm sure most of you have studied this in your basic ecology class, and it's the evolutionary succession of plants, going from pioneer plants all the way to old growth forest. So, would someone want to make a guess as to where you think vine, vineyards, grapes would fall on that? Somewhere, what do you think? I guess. More? Back?
Yeah.
Probably right about here, shrubs maybe, somewhere's in there. Yeah, that's what I always thought. This is where they actually fit in. Old growth. Grapes co-evolved with oaks in what's now modern day Iraq and Iran, the Caucasus Mountains. And so they co-evolved in that old growth ecosystem. One of the characteristics of an old growth ecosystem is on this side, you're bacterially dominated. On this side, you're fungally dominated. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not an interaction. They always have elements of both. But it's part of the reason why old growth has such complex interspecies, intercellular, microbiomic complexity is because it has the neural network of the fungi in that system, whereas simple system, not so much. There's a couple of really cool TED videos out there that's called Fungi and how forests communicate and stuff. They're great videos. I'd highly recommend them. I recommend them even more after the glass of wine. Those videos are always more entertaining after a couple glasses. But it's amazing. What they're talking about is that neural network. And there's even a theory in evolution that basically says the transition between sort of plants and animals happened because fungi got together with this, and it was the beginnings of a model of a neural network. That the neural network that we have actually shares a lot in common with the neural networks of fungi and plants. The difference with plants, instead of being single organisms that we detached our roots and we walk around, they're large mega-organisms. This is the classic work of Elaine Ingham. If you are interested in the soil food web, she is sort of the source of a lot of this. Elaine does some really interesting work. She did this work for the USDA Healthy Soils Initiative, it's called. It's remarkable that the USDA is actually ahead of a lot of commercial interests, and I dare say even ahead of some universities in the understanding of soil microbiology and what's happening biologically. A pitch for where you guys find yourself at the University of California at Riverside. A lot of universities have gotten themselves sort of locked into a position because they do so much co-research with the existing agricultural systems. UCR has always kind of held itself as a land-grant college doing independent research. There's going to be a huge shift in research where we're looking more at really complex microbiological systems. And I suspect that UCR is going to be one of a very small handful of universities that are really studying that. If you're interested in that kind of cutting edge in the sciences, this is a really good place to be. And yeah, there's not many other places doing it. So I would encourage you to talk to your professors and find out what's going on with this, and even encourage them to head in that direction. This talks about what we talked a little bit before, is bacteria breaks down the organic matter, the protozoa, and bacteria, fungi, everything, anthropods kind of chew. But as it goes along, those nutrients get released. The other thing that we're just finding out that's interesting with plants is they hold certain species that allow the soil biochemistry to go from aerobic to anaerobic. So when you're in a disturbed system, you tend to either be overly aerobic or overly anaerobic. But if you look at balanced forest systems, they tend to be somewhere in the middle. And there's a whole group of organisms called facultates, especially facultative bacteria, that can actually go either way. And that's how the plant sort of manipulates. I like to think of the grapevine or the plant as the conductor of a large orchestra. It's all there, it has the piece, it knows what the system is supposed to be like, and it's conducting, it's bringing things up as it needs it. It's signaling the trombones and and trying to discourage, the timpani guys because they're always too enthusiastic. So agriculture and carbon sequestration. This is a graph of different forms of life and their potential for sequestering carbon. So this is bacteria, fungi, and a number of things. This is mollusks, livestock. I love this little thing on the bottom because it shows, I don't know if you can see these, each one of these blocks is made up of 100 smaller blocks. Each one of those blocks is this unit here. So here's the other cool thing. If you're in the sciences, you sometimes get to make up your own units. And each one of these units is the equivalent of 1,000 cows. How they came up with that standard of unit, I don't know, but I think it's a really cool unit. So this is 1,000 cows, well, one of those little blocks. Each one of those little blocks, there's 100 in each one of those. Each one of those makes up those larger blocks. So, it's all, factors of 10. If you look at all this, if you add fish, humans, and all that, that's what non-plant life has the potential to sequester in carbon. But if you look at plant life, the problem is the scales don't fit. If you take all of this and compress it down to that, that's what it looks like in comparison. And so if I was to scale this correctly, it would look like this. That's everything else, and that's plants. That's why with carbon sequestration, plants rule the school. They're it. It's where and if you actually think about it, where are those animals getting most of their carbon from? Plants. Plants are the foundation of this whole thing of carbon sequestration. And the reason why there's excess carbon in the atmosphere now is we're taking really, 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 really old compost, it's called oil, and burning it and releasing the carbon. And by the way, so if you look at the photosynthetic formula and just reverse it, it's basically burning. I mean, that's the cool part about when we consume sugar. You literally take the photosynthetic chemical formula, flip it around and run it backwards, and it releases energy. So for carbon sequestration, plants are definitely where we need to go with this. I didn't include this slide, but we did a quick calculation on our vineyard, which is, I calculated all the vineyards that I have in at least 3 years of a biological program, which is about 120 acres or so. And I calculated the savings from no-till, from nitrogen fixation, and from 1 year of cover crop. And it came out to the carbon output equivalent of 107 people. So on a 100-acre vineyard, I was able to sequester the carbon of over 100 people. That's person per acre, roughly. Part of this, we have 96 full-time employees. That means just by using good land management practices, we were able to sequester the carbon output of every single full-time employee we have. It shows the potential that we have of doing that. So a quick comparison, industrialized agriculture versus sustainable, or regenerative. So industrialized agriculture sees soil as a medium for delivering soluble nutrients to the plants. I hope they don't teach this anymore. It's what I was taught in college. And if someone does teach it, you have to raise your hand and that's really questionable. It degrades the soil food web. It releases CO2 and decreases soil carbon, otherwise known as oil. That's how we generally measure organic carbon. It creates nutrient-deficient food. This is a whole nother lecture, and there's a lot of debate about this. But I spent most of my life in pharmaceutical research and nutrient research, and it's just true. One of the ways you can tell if you eat wild foods, they're quite a bit more nutrient dense. To give you some idea, we did some experiments with heirloom tomatoes in a biologically active soil. So they were genetically selected not for production capacity, but for good color, quality, which equals nutrient density, by the way. And we were getting results where, I remember on the calcium, was 9.5 times the calcium of a store-bought tomato. If you couple that with the average person now consumes roughly 2,000 calories with the activity level we had, hunter-gatherers were burning somewhere between 4 and 6, double to 3 times the amount of calories. So think about that. You're burning 3 times the amount of calories and eating food that's anywhere from 2 to 10 times nutritionally more dense. It's no wonder that we have a lot of degenerative diseases now that are associated with nutrient deficiency. This is one of the promises of regenerative agriculture. It doesn't just regenerate the planet, it's hopefully going to regenerate our health. And there's ecosystem service degradation. the concept of ecosystem services is that clean water, clean air, genetic diversity, all of those things come as a byproduct of the ecosystem. And without it, we don't survive. So the whole idea that we can somehow sort of manipulate nature and be outside of it is a fool's concept. Nature literally generates the very things that we need to survive. And industrial agriculture, part of the reason is it relies on synthetic inputs, which are really expensive. The majority of the farmer's income is now going to industrial chemical companies instead of going to their families as forced labor or communities for people to help out and local compost operations, those kind of things. If you compare that to regenerative, it's soil systems that are consistently improving soil health. That's the fundamental marker that you look at regenerative systems. Are the multiple markers of soil health constantly improving? It supports the soil food web. One of the standard tests we do is every month we take a bunch of samples, we put it in water, we look at it under a microscope, and we count bacteria, which is more fun than it sounds. Especially when you work in a winery, you get to drink wine. That really helps. But it's kind of cool. I don't know if any of you have spent much time with just, it's usually at anywhere between 200 to 400x. But man, when you're that small, it is really scary down there. Everything is trying to eat everything. And it makes you really glad that we're on this scale, because down there it's a pretty wild ride of what's going on. But the more healthy the soil food web is, that's what it does. Everything's eating everything. It sequesters carbon. It doesn't take it out of the soil. It builds organic matter, which is one of the primary ways it sequesters carbon. It creates nutrient-dense food as medicine. There's that famous quote, I think it's Hippocrates, if I'm not mistaken, that make food your medicine and medicine your food. Your food should be your medicine. You shouldn't have to take medicine, because you ate too many Doritos, or that you're eating a McDonald's too much, or whatever. Your food should be your medicine. Now, once in a while, I have to admit, I like an egg once in a while. But the vast majority of your food should enhance your health. It shouldn't take away from it. And it increases the value of ecosystem services. A quick example of this, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, we had 6.8 inches of rain in our vineyard in 23 hours. And we had 4 of those in the last 3 hours. And of course, I'm out when all this is going, watching the roads, and my neighbors' yards are falling apart. Rancho California road washed out. Actually, the road to my house washed out. I just got back a couple weeks ago. The bridge washed out completely. Everything was falling apart, except the vineyards that we formed organically and we had cover crops in it. Not only were they holding up, but not a drop left. Even at that rate, the soil tilt was so good that it just absorbed all of it. And the way I can tell is 3/4 of my vineyard is sort of isolated and it drains into one drainage and it's by itself. The other quarter has runoff from the neighbors' properties. I went to that culvert that drains our part and there was still dust at the bottom. The rest of the world's fallen, there's arcs floating by and there's cruise ships going by, and this culvert is still dry. And then it absorbed 100% of that. Not only did it absorb 100% of it, but because it's biologically active soil, any contaminants that were in that soil are removed, and the soil that goes into the aquifer is cleaner than the soil that entered it. That's the value of ecosystem services. That part of the economic model that we have that doesn't work particularly well is farmers aren't paid for that. I think farmers should be paid for that. It's a very valuable thing. And it decreases or eliminates the reliance on the synthetic outputs. Here's another aspect that ties into sort of that sustainable. Regenerative agriculture must also regenerate the farmers' bank accounts. And as scientists, it's something I know that we don't like to talk about a whole lot, but no margin, no mission. You can have the grandest ideas in the world. If you can't pay for it, you're not going to succeed. So you have to make sure that whatever you're doing has an economic model. And it must perform in the current economic models. Unfortunately, our current economic models, they do a lot of things called, outsourcing costs. So there was a lot, in Scandinavia, we did a lot of studies saying, what if we actually look at the input of the impact of global warming? And what if we actually looked at all of the negative aspects of burning fossil fuels, and we put a tax on it to compensate for that, and reverse those trends? They came up, this is years ago, they came up with an estimate of somewhere between $9 and $14 per gallon for fuel. So now that would probably be about 12 to 20. So think about it, if gasoline was $20 a gallon, how many electric and hydrogen powered or whatever cars would there be? But the system's it's rigged against true cost accounting. So when you're looking at ecological principles, you have to be careful when the economists come in, because they often don't look at it as a biological system. And it is yet another field, if you're interested in biology and if you're interested in this, having a background in biology, if you also have an interest in economics, you're going to be a pretty hot item. Because if we don't start learning how to measure the true value of things, the economic system is not going to work. You know, what you measure is what gets watched. And we've been measuring just the inside growth of money, not the real value, which is clean water, clean health, enjoyment, genetic diversity, all of those things. Two examples of this, the hidden cost of industrialized agriculture. This is health spending as a percentage of GDP. So this is automatically compensated for inflation and all this stuff. This is what percentage of the gross domestic product we spent on healthcare. In 1970s, it was about 6.5%, and now we're up to 18%. That's a triple of the percentage, and it's not because we necessarily have better healthcare, even though that is a factor in this. So even taking that into account, I would estimate that that's probably a third. That our healthcare has gotten more expensive and all that. But if you look at the rate of degenerative diseases, a lot of degenerative diseases are 10, 15, 20 times what they used to be. And degenerative diseases, things like Alzheimer's, things like diabetes, are really expensive to care for. That's what's driving a lot of this cost up. So part of the cost of having an ineffective food system is that we're spending a lot more of our money on healthcare. Here's another one, taking a look at global warming. If you look at the projected temperature differences and the impact that's going to have on the economy, what percentage of the world's GDP are going to have to be allocated towards offsetting those damages? And they are estimating that that is going to get up somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 or 12%. So if you take 12% from there, 12% on the healthcare, just on those two things, we're taking a quarter of what you're going to be producing in your lifetime and pushing them towards costs that were externalized. That's a quarter that you could buy a really nice tractor and a really nice pickup with. But instead, you're paying for these externalized costs. Soil organic matter has been, the calculation, there was the United Nations international, I forget, it's a big United Nations study that came out, I think it was 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, it was 2 years ago. Really well done study. And they said soil organic matter increase of about 0.5 to 2% per year. I didn't finish that sentence when I wrote it. Okay, so the sentence should say, could sequester 100% of the excess CO2. Here's the caveat with this number. That means that all major agricultural systems would have to have that 0.5 to 2% increase. So that's not going to happen. But a big chunk of it, there's no reason why half of major agriculture would be there, which means that we can easily take half of what we're putting and start sequestering it just by increasing it 0.5 to 2% per year. And that's about, I'm doing about 0.5 in my vineyards, which is a little harder because we're in a very arid environment. If you're in the Midwest, that's easy. 1 to 2% every year is actually pretty easy to do if you're doing it right. You do that through integrated livestock mob grazing. A quick word about this. A lot of people who are in the environmental sciences like to bash livestock. It's large containment livestock that's a bad deal. Livestock that's integrated into an ecosystems approach for agriculture are some of the most beneficial things in nature. Because think about what nature does. On the plains, you'll get the winter rains, you'll get huge stands of grass. Who comes along? Buffalo. They trample most of it into the ground, which is like disking it in. Eat some of it, process it, poop it, get the microbiome going, Who comes behind them? The smaller animals. Who comes behind them? The prairie pheasants. Who comes behind them? The dung beetles. And there's this whole little parade that kind of goes through. The concept of mob grazing, there's Gabe Brown in South Dakota is doing that on his farm, and he's come up with a couple of interesting things. He has increased his soil organic matter 1.5 to 2% every year for the last 10 years. He is also 10 times more profitable per acre than his neighbor because he has income from livestock, income from chickens. He has all these income streams coming in. He's not only integrating the ecosystem, he's integrating the financial system. Crop rotation and cover crops you're probably familiar with. No-till and low-till increases the fungal population, stable carbon. Fungi is a great source of stable carbon because they're basically carbon nanotubes. That's what fungal hyphae are, and they're super stable. An increase in the photosynthetic capacity of plants. And here's the other thing that people don't talk about, and I think we need to talk about more. Farming regeneratively is just more fun. A lot of the reason people got into agriculture is it's actually enjoyable. I mean, getting up at dawn and being outside and seeing the crops growing, it's really fun. It's just that the stress of modern agriculture is kind of taking the fun out of it. So hopefully we can do that. This is another quote from the Rodale Institute that said if we could increase the carbon in the soil by just 0.04% a year, we can preserve all the carbon we currently emit. So plants functioning in a highly photosynthetic efficiency are the engines that develop soils, not the other way around. And this was actually an epiphany for me because I always thought healthy soils, healthy soils, healthy soils. We have to have healthy soils to have healthy plants. But that's not what creates healthy soils. Healthy plants create healthy soils. Healthy soils are the byproduct of having healthy plants. The average industrialized crops have a theoretical photosynthetic efficiency of around 15 to 20% of genetic potential. This is work that was done University of Iowa and then followed up by Don Huber out of Purdue. Now, you'll never get to 100%, right? Because you have hot days, you have really wet seasons. There's a lot of variables. But the idea that we're at 15 to 20% means that we're leaving a lot of genetic potential on the table. An increase in photosynthetic efficiency doesn't necessarily mean an increase in yield. So if you double the photosynthetic efficiency, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll get twice the yield of whatever crop you're after. But it does mean that there's a lot more sugar to go back into the soil to drive that engine. Ultimately, what that means is an improvement in genetic chemotypical expression. In other words, if you are providing the plant with all the trace minerals and macronutrients it needs to run at a higher photosynthetic efficiency, you get higher nutritional density foods that improve animal and human health. It's a cycle. We are part of that cycle. That's the problem with pulling nutrients out of that cycle, is we are in it. So here's how you get to it. Foliar and fertigation nutrients. Compost works great. I actually studied with Elaine Ingham for 3 years. I love Elaine pieces. I think she's also absolutely right. The problem is, if you try and compost your way into profitability, you're probably going to go broke because you don't get enough results fast enough. But foliar, everybody familiar with foliar nutrition, what that means? So you can actually take nutrients, and especially if they're in chelated form, you can spray them on the leaves and they absorb through the leaves, through the stomachs. So it's the equivalent of, instead of eating 10 pounds of popcorn with yeast in it to get enough B vitamins, just getting a shot of B vitamins. It's a lot more direct. It's roughly about 80% efficient, whereas soil applications are usually in the single digits. So it's a great way of getting nutrients in. Biological inoculants take those nutrients that are in the soil and make them available for the plants. And we have to have a way of measuring plant health and nutritional integrity. Classically, we've done that through plant-based analysis and soil analysis. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But here's a concept that's not talked about much. Most of the time when you're deficient in, let's say, calcium, you'll say, okay, we just need to add more calcium. But if you have excess sodium and potassium, it's going to antagonize the calcium. more often than not, like I would venture to say about 80% of the time, I've corrected nutritional deficiencies by getting rid of excess, not by adding more stuff to it. So that's why you have to sort of understand the whole system. Because more often than not, nutritional deficiencies are from excess. Once you understand that, you can adjust your foliar management program that then enhances your soil biology. And over time, you stop having to mess with the plants. Once you get that system going, you can kind of just step back and let the system run itself. You know, plants did fine before we showed up, and they'll continue to do fine. We need to learn how to support their systems and then step and get out of the way. This is something interesting. If you look at what's called the biochemical sequestration of nutrients in plants, it just shows that you need boron to free up calcium. They happen in a sequence. So if any one part is missing, the whole chain falls apart. So this is classically what we do. It's something called petioles. Petioles are the part that connects the leaf to the stem of the plant. You take those and grind them up and test the nutrients. The problem with that is some of those nutrients are actually bound in the tissue of the plant. So you don't know what's going on in the sap. You only know what's in the tissue. So you can have a plant that has lots of calcium in its tissue, but it's deficient in calcium in its sap, which means that biologically and functionally, it's deficient in calcium. So you need to find a better way. So we're doing a system called Sap Analysis. And in Sap Analysis, you have to take into account there's mobile minerals, there's medium and mobile minerals. So the mobile minerals are always going to be in the sap, right? The medium ones, you probably want to look whether it's stealing from the older leaves to go to the younger leaves. This is a basic concept. If a plant needs nutrients and they're fairly mobile, it will steal from the older ones to give to the younger ones. Because all things take from the older and give to the younger ones. It's why a lot of your parents cashed in the money that they were going to buy that Winnebago with and gave it to you to come here. Because things always steal from the old and give to the new. Plants do the same thing. And you can tell a lot by how the plant's deficient, by how those are flowing from one level to the other. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, there's too much detail here, but this is a summation of the plant sap analysis that we did last year at Wilson Creek, all my vines combined. This is molybdenum. You can see early in the season it was really deficient, and then when I started foliaring, it picked up. Nitrogen, surprisingly enough, was in excess. I had lots of excess nitrogen, and then it kind of spent most of its time in the middle, except right when I got to the fruiting stage, it crashed on me a little bit. Potassium sort of jumped around all over the place. Potassium's not a big issue. Calcium, pretty consistently deficient. When you see an outlier like that, usually don't believe it. It's usually a problem. Somebody probably dropped something in the bag. They're chewing on Tums or something. They're dropping the bag. Probably showed up. I don't know what that is about. Sodium started out low and got higher. That's because we irrigate with water that has a fair amount of sodium. So the sodium builds up over time. Same with chloride. This is coming in sodium chloride. Sulfur was kind of okay, and it picked up later in the season. You notice the trend here? A lot of these things early on are deficient, and they sort of picked up. Two things. I was actually foliar feeding some of these, not all of these. But the other thing is the Biogeography has went along. Phosphorus started out okay and then dropped. Phosphorus is needed for fruit. I blew it last year. Right here, when I needed enough phosphorus to fill out the fruit, I didn't give it enough. It dropped. It sucked all of the phosphorus out of the leaves to give to the fruit. Because if you have a younger sibling, you know that the hierarchy of things, the older people are on the bottom, you're somewhere in the middle, and the young ones, everything goes to them. They're the youngest. The younger you are, the baby gets all of the phosphorus in this case. Silica was okay all year. Iron, deficient pretty much all year. Manganese, kind of all over the place. Zinc, very deficient. When I needed it, fruit set, I knew it. I applied foliar. I didn't do it long enough. Boron, same exact story. I needed it early, I didn't get it on early enough. Once the plant didn't need it, it had surplus. Copper, same exact story. Copper is needed for fruit set. Molybdenum, same story. So, I just wanted to run through that really quickly to show you that we actually have the tools now to dial in exactly what the plant needs. And once we learn how to get all of those into this sweet spot, this should have been between those two gray lines consistently. If it was, I could bump that photosynthetic efficiency from that 15, 20% to 45, 50, 60%, which means not only would I get better fruit, which makes better wine, but a lot of that surplus sugar is going to go back into the soil, stimulate the microbiome, and then I have to do less of this because the plant now has the savings account in the soil to pull what it needs when it needs it. This is the basic concept of regenerative agriculture. It's taking a look at complete photosynthesis, complete protein as you move up. On the bottom here, you get passive immunity based on chemistry. So what that means, for example, aphids, pretty much any sucking insect is on that plant. There's a guy named William Ulrich, who's a famous agricultural writer, and he said insects are the garbage disposals of the ecosystems. What it means, if a plant isn't healthy, the insects are there to get rid of it. So insects can only digest simple carbohydrates and simple proteins. So, simple nitrogens. So if your plant is not healthy enough, the insects can feed on it. That's passive immunity. Active immunity is when plants produce secondary metabolite chemicals to actually fight off the plants or to kill the plants. I believe that's what Philippe was studying in the grapevines when he found a relationship between soil fungi that produces that active immunity that actually kills the xylophaeosis. So level 1, the volume of photosynthetic efficiency increases 150 to 600%. Carbohydrate profiles change, which means the plants are less likely to get insects, and you get an increase in Brix. This also, once that happens, the soil ecosystem is such that we stop getting really simple fungal pathogenic diseases. And it makes sense because most fungal pathogens are actually garbage collectors. They're there to clean up the dead and dying tissue. So once you get past the pretty low threshold, most of that stuff goes away. I wanted to do a check on the time because we're scheduled for 5. We started kind of late.
Yeah, it's 4:54, so yeah, if you can finish at 5, that would be great.
Okay. I'll just go through this really quickly. As you go up to level 2, level 3 happens with increased lipid synthesis. This is when plants really start functioning at a higher level. And level 4 is the plant's secondary metabolites happen, and you wind up getting induced and secondary resistance. What induced means is when an insect bites, it produces compounds. Or if it's passive, it's just there automatically. So, quick talk about terroir, and I'll connect this to the microbiome. The notion that a wine also has a sense of embodiment of place strikes me as the most unique quality of this magical beverage, the most valuable thing wine can teach us. Terroir is that unique quality that wines that come from a certain region always have a unique taste that you can identify. There's a lot of debate about that. I'm not going to go through that right now. But what I do want to talk about is this. Is everyone familiar with the concept of a paradigm shift? Yes, it's okay. This is pretty basic scientific. Non-scientists don't know what this means, so usually everyone knows this. So here's an interesting paper. It's called The Theory of Microbiological Biogeography. A group of geneticists with UC Davis went out to some vineyards in Sonoma, Napa, and the Central Coast, I believe. They took a complete sample of the microbiome, soil, air, plant tissue. They just basically took it all and said, okay, we're going to identify what it is, and then we're going to put it in a database, and we're going to scramble it. And then we're going to say, find out what naturally associates with what, where there's natural reorganizations of the data. So here's the 2 things they found. Is it associated, look on the top, with Chardonnay, there's Cabernet, and there's Zinfandel. And it's sort of followed a long varietal, which isn't that surprising because you think different varietals would have a similar microbiome. Even though it's pretty cool that actually lined up like that. Here's the super cool part. Napa, Central Coast, and Sonoma are all known for having extremely distinct terroirs. You can tell wines from those regions really obviously when you're skilled in it and as a sommelier. The genetics lined up remarkably with that, which means people, the geologist said terroir comes from geology, the biologist from everyone has their own little pet preference as to where this comes from. It's probably the overarching thing that's holding all together is the microbiome. Where is the microbiome gathering around those things? So this is directly from the summary of the article. And I know a lot of you read a fair amount of scientific papers, and I assume you had the same thought that I had reading the summaries of, well, maybe this might mean something and it needs further research and da-da-da, and you're thinking in the back of your head, man, this guy is shit. Why don't you just say what you actually think it is and stand behind it? Well, here's what they say. We demonstrate that a great associated microbial biogeography is non-randomly associated with the regional varietal climatic factors across a multi-scale viticultural zone. This poses a paradigm shift in our understanding of food and agricultural systems beyond grape and wine production, where patterns of whole microbial communities associate with agricultural products may associate with downstream quality characteristics. I hope that sinks in as to how significant this is, that we now have a model of looking at the whole system. I also know that you guys have a really strong microbiome initiative, which is why I think that you are much more better lined up to take advantage of this sort of new understanding of what's going on. So, take-home messages. Regenerative agriculture may be the best way to improve human and environmental health. Regenerative agriculture can perform both financially and environmentally. That's important to be sustainable for both. Technology can assist in a systems approach to agriculture. This is the new approach to agriculture. And this is a great time to be in agricultural research. And not just because I'm a farming geek. If I struggled for years trying to get a biological approach and it just wasn't out there, you are at the dawn of a really, really interesting era. And it's a great position because when you graduate with some training in this, you will be in high demand. To give you some, when I was in natural medicine and natural products, there was literally just a handful of this. When it became popular, my income went from $30,000 to $240,000 in 1 year. Because we're in such demand. That's not the only reason to do it. You should do it because you love what you do. But I'll tell you what, like May West said, I did before, I did rich. And what we do to our environment, we do to ourselves. All right, thank you.